pray for the teachers downstairs and the students downstairs as well as ourselves up here. We pray that this class will be beneficial to all and Father be with us as we listen and learn. In Jesus' name we pray.
Amen.
Okay, so some of this I'm going to kind of just go through pretty quickly and just kind of do a heading, you might say, for a few verses at a time. And some things I'd like to emphasize and ask questions as we go along. There's obviously going to be starting in chapter 5. And then here in verse 1, Ecclesiastes chapter 5 and verse 1, walk prudently when you go into the house of God and draw near to hear, rather than to give the sacrifice of fools, for they do not know that they do evil. That's that idea that they're naive or they are doing things incorrectly. What would be our issue today, you might say? What would fit into that category of being the fool?
One who goes for health and wealth, to hear a sermon on health and wealth.
To hear a sermon on health and wealth?
Yeah, that's foolish.
Yeah, that foolishness. I guess what I'm trying to do is make it applicable to us, and that is that if our hearts are not engaged, how easy is it to let your mind drift when you know that song you've sung it 1,000 times? Maybe a long prayer. We get accustomed to a certain length of things, and we kind of can lose our attention in those kinds of activities. And so we have to be careful in regard to our sacrifice that maybe it's not that much of a sacrifice after all if we're not engaged. And so he says, walk prudently when you go to the house of God and draw near to hear. Why would that be the case? It's an opportunity for instruction, right? And so there's a lot of people who say, well, I didn't, in that sense, didn't get their bucket filled. And I thought that was quite interesting that Jesse tonight in his prayer come with an empty heart in that sense to fill it up. And we should, if we're going to be engaged properly, even if things aren't done in the best sense, we should still get something from it. And we should gain, come to hear, draw near to hear. So in verses 2 and 3, think before you talk and don't say much. Better to be thoughtful than to what? Open your mouth and remove all doubt. So verses 4 through 7, do what you say and don't make excuses. What New Testament passage would this coincide with? It's actually Jesus' teaching. Turn over to Matthew chapter 5. Matthew chapter 5, and we'll read verse 37. Matthew chapter 5, of course, this is Sermon on the Mount. In verse 37, we read, and let your yes be yes and your no, no, for whatever is more than these is from the evil one. And so what is that? What's the simplicity of that instruction?
Just say what you mean and be honest whatever you say.
All right.
Yes is yes and no is no. You don't have to vow. You don't have to
Right.
promise I'm going to do it. If I say I'm going to do it, it's the same as me vow.
Right. And that was my next question is what does that exclude? You should never have to say I promise. You should never say I swear I'll do it, or I won't do it. You shouldn't have to ever, and Jesus addresses swearing by the temple and, that kind of thing in other passages. So in verse 8, don't be surprised when those in power protect one another and oppress whom? Oppress the poor. And so there's wisdom for the rich given here in this text in verses 9 through 20. So in verse 9, the earth sustains all alike. And Jesus expressed this in what way? In fact, in the Sermon on the Mount, again, that the sun shines on the good and the bad, and the rain falls on the good and the bad. Everyone benefits from the grace of God in that sense. So in verses 10 and 11, riches never satisfy. His verses may get caught up here. In verses 12 through 13, the sleep of a laboring man is sweet, whether he eats little or much, but the abundance of the rich will not permit him to sleep. There is a severe evil which I have seen under the sun, riches kept for their owner to his hurt. How is that possible that someone is wealthy and it is to his own hurt? Thomas.
Basically, he can be in such a state where the idea of his stuff gets stolen will just throw him in a tailspin out of control. Because in his mind, it's everything that he has. Remember one of the billionaires of our time, Bill Gates, was crying when he started losing a couple $1 billion. That's how much he loves money. So that's what that thing, and that's what that means.
Sydney?
Also, too, if you have that kind of wealth, you don't trust nobody.
Okay.
And you cannot, it keeps you from interacting socially and, with anybody, because it's like everybody's not to get me, you get what I've got.
Okay. Tom?
We have the need to want sometimes. And if we're full all the time, if everything good happens to us all the time, we don't appreciate anything bad. That's basically what I'm trying to say.
Right.
It also talks about, my reference is Ecclesiastes 6:1 and 2. And it's like, if the rich man doesn't take of it, a foreigner could come in and consume it. So, and that's another reason why a rich man may not be able to sleep. We get the pure rest because they're worried about the riches that are in their, in their barns or whatever.
Right. Yeah, and I think there in verses 1 and 2 of chapter 6, and we'll get to it here in just a moment, is that idea of when he's gone. But nonetheless, so I do have a list here. What will happen to my wealth is one of those questions that you could certainly ask. And then, of course, security. So we have to secure that wealth in some form or fashion, whether that's securing our house from being broken into, locking our cars. This is the simplicity of that idea of having to protect. And then the personal health due to worry. We're wringing our hands at the possible loss. And you'll notice in verse 17, all his days he also eats in darkness. This is kind of the curse of those who do not handle wealth well. And he has much sorrow and sickness and anger. Those are three things that are accompanying the wealth. Now, if I were to ask you, okay, who wants $1 million? Most likely you're gonna, who wants to be wealthy? Sign me up. Ephesians chapter 6, beginning in, not Ephesians, excuse me, 1 Timothy chapter 6, beginning in verse 6, it says, now blank with blank. Do you know what it says? What are those? Now, no, start with the first word. Now, starts with a G. Now, godliness with contentment is what? Great gain. For we brought nothing into this world, and certainly we can carry nothing out. And having food and clothing, we shall be content. And then it goes into the warning about being rich. And, do you have to sin to be rich, or do you have to be rich to sin? No. So you can be very, very poor and still be covetous. You can be very rich and be the most giving person, and so on. In other words, if we're going to hoard, if we're going to hang on to this, we're going to have that security. We're going to have a loss of health, you might say, and worrying over that. Anxiety. You may have some wealth guilt. What's wealth guilt? Not someone's going to take it from you.
That you're not helping people that could use it.
Right.
Being wealthy and knowing that you're not doing.
You don't want to let go of it, but you don't want the guilt that's associated with having the wealth too. How many of us could be guilty of that? Now, we may not feel too guilty unless it comes, it's the offering or something on Sunday, and we start thinking, there was someone that we could have helped and we didn't. We've spent all our money on ourselves and the house and the cars and the vacations and our savings. I mean, even good things, nothing wrong in of themselves, but we're spending it all on ourselves, and what do we have left at the end? And that I've made the application already about giving to the Lord, right? In regard to our financial wealth. But what about being able to help someone but you can't because you've done spend it all? And that's just as bad, if not worse, you might say, because you think about Matthew chapter 25. And so Jesus says, when I was hungry, you what? Does that cost money? Yeah. I was thirsty, you gave me a drink. I was naked. Does that cost money?
Yes.
Yeah. Does it cost money to go to the prison, to visit the sick, gasoline, resources, whatever? It costs. And if we're all self-consuming, we may have that wealth guilt on occasion that says, I should have helped someone, but I can't do it anyways. But then you kind of feel guilty that you didn't when you should have been able to, and so on. Maybe we should have a little bit more guilt. I don't know. Lamar.
Or I think sometimes helping doesn't always have to be monetary.
Right.
It can be time, other resources.
Absolutely.
So, I think today, in this century, or 18, well, I would just say within the 2000s era, I think it's come to the point where you see someone who's actually not homeless, but asking for money. They don't have a certain number. That number doesn't exist anymore. It's either a $20 bill or more. And I think it's widespread in the sense of it's always expecting it monetary as opposed to, oh, you're homeless. Well, let's just go out for a meal or something, and they always use that. So I'm not knocking the homelessness. I'm saying, I think when we think about homelessness, it always has to be this money.
Right. Well, I emphasized just recently that it's a whole lot easier just to fork out some money and walk away than it would be to go and take that person into your home, literally. That's the kind of hospitality that an overseer is to have to the stranger. You don't know them, and you bring them into your home. How vulnerable are you making yourself in that circumstance? And how many of us have done that? And it's an uneasy feeling when you open your home to a complete stranger like that. Cindy?
John has one.
Oh, John? Did you have a?
What I was going to say is, we have to remember that money in itself is not bad.
Right.
It's how if you put it before our Lord, you have to have it. It's bad.
Right. I think it's verse 8 there in 1 Timothy chapter 6. That the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. And so the fear of loss, obviously. So there's always those tests that we're going to have. In verse 14, money can grow wings and do what? Fly away. Much like Proverbs 23 and verse 5 says. Verses 15 and 16, you can't what with your money? You can't take it with you. There's no U-Haul being pulled by a hearse, right? So this is a Texas thing. Excuse me because it's a Texas thing. Who cares what it is? But anyways, this guy, of course, it had to be Texas. This guy is very wealthy, and guess what he wants to be buried in? His big old long Cadillac from the 70s, and he's sitting in the driver's seat. You think that he's taking that with him? No. But the Egyptians were well known for that type of gifts, if you will. In verse 17, sorrow, sickness, and anger, we pointed that out already, accompanying wealth. Verse 18, enjoy life and don't be consumed by it. It doesn't take much to satisfy us, does it? Or it shouldn't. How much do you have to eat to be satisfied, in other words? What kind of clothing do you really have to have? For years, I did a slide for the Lord's Supper, but I also had a slide for which had a scripture, but also for the giving. And so one of those slides, there's a woman sitting there in this room for her closet, where it has a bench in the middle and there's still lots of room. And she's sitting there kind of dismayed. And all around in the picture, there's clothes that are just right up against one another. And she says, I have nothing to wear. I don't remember what verse I associated that with. But how How many pairs of pants? How many shirts do you have to have? You know, it's interesting in the Bible where it says that, okay, if you have 2 tunics, right? It's not saying if you have 15, go give half of them away. If you have 2, give 1 to someone. And so the other side of that coin is the idea that if you have abundance and there's someone in need, do what? You got to let go of it. That's not always easy, is it? So I think we're all guilty to a certain degree of holding on, right? And no one's going to sign up to be the rich young ruler where Jesus says, go sell everything you have. Well, that was the rich young ruler. Well, that might be me too. That might be required of me. And he was unwilling. And so we have to put ourselves in check. And every now and then we put ourselves in check when there's that person that's in need. And if we hang on and we don't let go of what we can do, it's not, of course, limited to monetarily. So in verses 19 and 20, before we jump into chapter 6, the gift of God, what the Lord has given us. Being busy and rejoicing in our labor is where happiness can be found. So in chapter 6, Enjoy and Appreciate Life is how I've titled it, verses 1 through 12. The whole chapter there. So in verses 1 through 6, there are some who have received riches, wealth, and honor, yet don't enjoy them. Too many can't enjoy their lives because they're never satisfied. The stillborn, he writes, is better off than they. You know, the idea that you could be so busy to maintain what you have, to increase what you have, whatever that is, to accumulate, that you can't enjoy life. Do you know any workaholics in your life? Are you one yourself?
What I was going to say is that complaint has a lot to do with that too. Because I work with people that complain about what lane they're on. Why do they have to work? And I hear this stuff that I don't like to talk to them because it's like, you're a downer. You're making it sound like it's a terrible thing. And I think about, like, you should be grateful you even have a job.
Yeah. Right. That's the challenge, huh? Thomas?
I've been one of those that not even complain, but have not been satisfied with what they have been a workaholic. I've been one of those, and it's very miserable when you really break it down. Like I've said before, it makes you despise the fact you're even working, let alone your existence, because you're all wrapped up into it.
Right. But how many of us have ever walked into the boss and you sit down in your yearly review, and they say, we're going to give you a raise, and you go, oh, no, I don't want a raise. Yeah. Here's the bonus at the end of the year. No. Now, there are those. In fact, when I first started preaching in 95, there was a young man, he's 19 years old, started school out of high school. He went to college, and his parents gave him $100 to spend. Spending money, you might say. His school was paid for, books were paid for, food, clothing, the dorm, everything was paid for. And so here's $100, and he gave us $50 every month out of that. He says, this is more than what I need. All I need is $50. That's plenty. Because he had a meal ticket and so on. He just wanted $50 spending money. He gave us half of his. So there are those that are excellent givers. So verses 7 through 9, we do all to survive, yet this doesn't satisfy the eternal soul. This is my summary of these verses. The poor and the rich are no different in this endeavor. A bird in the hand is what? Worth 2 in the bush. So, are you and I just barely making it by? And if we are, if that is true, are you on a budget? Do you do a budget, or are you just, in other words, do we restrain ourselves? Do we, and I'm a big proponent of a budget, so excuse me for some of my own think-sos coming out, but do you control you're spending? Do you have a leash on yourself? Are you able to restrain yourself? We're not going to deal with it tonight, but do you think that covetousness is an issue in our society? Do you think that money, the love of money, is an issue? And if it's in society, oftentimes it filters itself into the church and into our hearts. And we find ourselves just keeping up with the Joneses. We find ourselves in the rat race. We find ourselves that Dolly and I went through a phase where we just had to have a new car. Otherwise, we might be broke down on the side of the road. Do you have to have a new car? Do we have to have the houses that we have? Angel could probably tell us a little bit. And I've been to South America. I've been in homes where there are huge potholes. I'm talking this deep, this big around was their kitchen. It was a dirt floor. The door was open because there's no heating or air conditioning. There was no electricity. The kitchen, if you will, was a pipe coming out in the middle of the yard. And you just turned it on and it was only water. There's no hot and cold. In the house there was, how like in a barn or whatever you could see through the eaves? That was it. It's not closed in, even though it had walls, so on. And so we think that we have to have certain things when we don't necessarily have to have those to survive. So you and I might find ourselves pursuing what we have to live when we really have set our standards so high. And it would do us good to go to some of those areas, those third world countries, if you will, and just get a little wake-up call of how wealthy we really, really are. In verses 10 through 12, God has established us. We are not better than God. Our life is fleeting at best, and only God knows what lies ahead. And so here we could be working for something, and in the end, what are we going to have as far as the accumulation of things here on this earth? No matter what, we're going to end up with a zero. We're not going to be able to take it with us. Everyone's heard the saying, I wonder how much old Uncle Joe left to the family. He left it all. He didn't take it with him, right? So in chapter 7, the effects of life on the heart. Verse 1, one's reputation far outweighs costly perfume, and the day of one's death than his birth. The day of his death is better than the day of his birth. Your reputation. So verses 2 through 4, mourning, sorrow, and sadness makes the heart better than feasting, laughter, and mirth. Mirth is that, joyous time. But is that where we go? If we had a choice between going to a wedding or going to a funeral, what are we going to choose? And so we're instructed to go to the funeral. That's what would be best. In verses 5 through 6, it is better to hear the rebuke of the wise than for a man to hear the song of fools. Something that sounds good to our ears, but it's foolishness. For like the crackling of thorns under a pot, so the laughter of the fool is also vanity. Or this also is vanity. What does he mean by that? We'll spend a few minutes there. What does he mean? Who wants to be rebuked? No one wants to be rebuked. But what's the point of the rebuke? To improve?
Tell you something you need to change.
Okay, need to change. So what's the deal with the laughter? Anything wrong with laughing? No. But if we always seek to be entertained, if we're always seeking to have that laugh, then what are we missing out on? We kind of covered this already. Nancy.
When you laugh, you're not taking something seriously.
Okay, yes, very good. And that definitely comes out. Thank you for making that point. That's very important. There's the seriousness of life, but he balances it with what? What does the preacher balance that with? Instruction, true, but to enjoy life. Go and labor. Put in a good day's work so that at the end of the day you can be satisfied that you put in a good day's work and you can rest. And you've got something from that. Now you have something to eat. You have something to wear. And so there's a benefit, but you realize that's as far as it's going to go. Guess what you're going to have to do tomorrow? We don't live those kinds of lives. When Jesus instructs, give us this day, how serious was he about that? I mean, he gave the money bag to whom? And what was he? He was a thief. He pilfered the money bag. And that's who Jesus gave it to. You think he was worried about saving so much? But we live in a society where, we gotta work. We can't enjoy ourselves. We're worn out at the end of the day. There's no satisfaction. We gotta do it all again tomorrow. And so we get into that rat race. And God doesn't want that for us. But sometimes we do it to ourselves. And so the rebuke is along those same lines. It is to help us to better ourselves. But we rather just be told nothing or how good we're doing, right? That's what we would rather hear. In verse 7, God's wisdom is the best wisdom, and a bribe ruins the heart. In verse 8, better to finish with a patient spirit. In verse 9, fools hasten to be angry. Kind of a change of subject there. And so wisdom accepts things as they are. Notice in verse 10, do not say, why were the former days better than these? For you do not inquire wisely concerning this. The older you get, the more opportunity you have to do what? Reminisce. To reminisce. How easy is it to reminisce with rose-tinted glasses? It's what we do. That's the whole point, right? How is it that my grandparents would sometimes, I'm not trying to bag on them, but that generation would sometimes look back at the Depression and say, those were the good old days. Why would they brag that they had to walk to school uphill in the snow both ways? Why? Why is it that when some people reminisce, they remember the bad? And it's not to tear themselves down or to become bitter. Why are they remembering the bad? You hit on it earlier.
I do it because I'm happier where I am today than I was back 20 years ago, 25 years ago. So many things are behind me, at this point I understand that more of my life is behind me than in front of me.
Right.
And it helps me to realize and be more content where I am and not think about all of what I can grab anymore. It's more like, settling into the idea that I'm on the home stretch. I want to make it to that goal with God.
Right. Yeah, we're definitely more spiritually minded oftentimes. Yeah. But it's that idea in reminiscing in a positive way that it gives you appreciation for what you have now. Mm-hmm. Those bad times, in looking back they weren't all that great, but oftentimes when we reminisce, we remember the good, and we remember only the good. We don't remember those tough times, you might say. What would be the danger of that?
Repeating the bad stuff.
Repeating the bad? Tawana?
Not being grateful for what God has gotten you through.
Okay. Not grateful for what God has gotten you through. Calvin? I'm still looking for a little bit different answer. Not that those aren't correct by any means.
When I come to the gathering, You hear what you're saying. Now remember this, says iron sharpens iron. That's why we got it, so we can help them. Because let's say it's still faithful, if someone else is faithful, you still got something to do on that.
Okay, Thomas?
When you're talking about reminiscing, remembering dad, it can bring you down, make you depressed.
Okay.
Make you regret what you've done.
Yeah, that's getting closer to what I want to point out, Nancy.
When you remember the dad, you see what God brought you through and how he
Right.
helped you, and how I could have died many times living in Oklahoma because there was poisonous snakes, and we ran into them all the time. Do you know how many times he had to save me? Because we were a bunch of young girls, there was 5 of us, and
What?
we could have died.
There's no such thing.
And I didn't, no, I'm serious, I've survived. I sit there and I think, how did you ever survive?
Right.
God had a purpose for bringing me through it, because you have to, if you were, whatever you had, God gave it to you. If you had food to eat, that was from God.
Right. Right.
And you have to remember that He has taken care of you. It may not have been fine and hoity-toity, but He has taken care of us to this point in our lives.
Sure. Sure. Okay, so think about it this way. If I'm in this rush, which is being condemned by the preacher, right? Don't live life so fast, and don't be working for the future so much that you can't do what?
Stop and smell the roses.
Yeah, stop and smell the roses. If I reminisce and I look back, I may not appreciate what I have now. If I can balance the two, I'm working, towards an end, but I got something done today, and I can be satisfied in that. I can look back and go, you know what? The Lord has carried me through, and I am thankful for where I am. But if I'm too wound up about the future that may not even be here, because tomorrow's not promised, I'm working so hard I can't enjoy the fruit of my labor that I have today, be content. And if I'm reminiscing so much back here, then it might make me bitter, and it may not make me appreciate what I have now, because it's all good back then and not now. And I should be, I should have $500,000 in the bank by this age. And so on and so forth, whatever it is. I should be further along in my life. What's that movie that the guy meets his young self? No, not Back to the Future.
Well,
Willis, the kid.
Yeah.
And so he's meeting the kid is, 12-year-old kid's meeting his older self, and he finds out that he's not married.
He's a loser.
And he doesn't have the golden retriever, and he doesn't have that whatever that was that as a kid he expected to have as an adult, is the idea. So we reminisce and think, oh, that was all the good days. Now I'm miserable. And you don't have an appreciation for where you are. And that's a dangerous place to be. Working so much here, or I'm not happy where I am, I should be better off. Thomas?
I'm trying to say something.
Well, what I was gonna say, I think about what Jesus said. The past, you can't do nothing to do about it. The past is the past. You concentrate on what today, what you have today, but tomorrow will take care of itself. And a lot of times with people we get all worried, what am I gonna do tomorrow? We all should just concentrate on what we have to do today. Because tomorrow will come to us, yes or no. It's up to God that He lets us go to have another day of life. But when we talk about the past, we often think, well, we should talk about the past. Sometimes the past we don't want to talk about it, because all it's gonna do is, what am I gonna do about it? I can't change what I did, but I have to think about what I have to do today. And don't worry about tomorrow, because if God gives me another day, it'll start all over again.
Right. There were other hands, Calvin.
We always quote Matthew 6:33, but she brought up one of my favorite scriptures at the end of that chapter. Agree with her. It says, sufficient for the day is his own trouble. That's what she just got to preach. That's at the end of chapter 6.
Right.
Now people preach to 33 or 34, they never get down to what she said.
Right. Yeah, and that, don't worry about your life. It talks about the birds of the air and the field, the flower in the field.
It's, the application is Lot's wife. Looking back, if you think about it, Lot's wife looking back started a whole bunch of other evil. Because when she was turned into a pillar of salt, now you have the sin of Lot and his daughters.
Right. Yeah. The Ammonites, the Moabites, and they're very wicked people. Yeah. Okay, we're going to have to move on. Was there someone else? Okay. So in verse 11, wisdom pays in the long term. Verse 12, wisdom is defense and gives life. Verse 13, we are not better than God. Verse 14, not knowing what tomorrow brings, be content today. Verse 15, life is not fair. Get over it. It's the way it is. Verse 16, it's something I've told my children 1,000 times, and they get disappointed. I say, well, it's going to be a big part of your life. That's our phrase. It's a big part of your life. You just got to deal with it. I don't think it gets any better. That doesn't mean that we should be down in the dumps, but just realize, life's tough. And verse 17, wickedness and foolishness will be put in an early grave. But then we find out later on, as we'll continue, that sometimes they live a long life. And you're like, why? Verse 18, understand, hold on, and fear God. Verse 19, wisdom is great strength. Verse 20, all sin. Verses 21 and 22, don't be moved by your servant's ill will. You are guilty too. If you overhear your servant, say something derogatory about you, well, we got to get off our high horse and realize, we've probably done that ourselves. Don't take it to heart in verse 21, lest you hear your servant cursing you. For many times also your own heart has known that even you have cursed others. Isn't that amazing, though? The thief doesn't want anyone stealing from him. So the accomplishments of wisdom is futile. In verses 23 through 29, verse 23, the wiser you are, the more you realize you don't know. We kind of talked about that Sunday. Verse 24, the deeper things of wisdom is past finding out. There's just some things we could just drive ourselves crazy to figure out, and the answer will never be known. Verse 25 through 29, the preacher sought to know it all and found very wicked women. I'm so sorry, women. And only one good man out of 1,000. Not much better. God started us off right, but we have all become evil, left to our own devices. I had a good conversation with someone this last Sunday, and he's a Christian that has walked away from the Lord. Hope to have an influence on him, but ultimately he has, in his ascertainment of God's justice, has made himself wiser than God. That's a very dangerous place, Well, if I were doing it, I would have done it this way. You just blaspheme God by thinking such things. So may we not ever think we're wiser than the creator of the universe. So chapter 8. Oh, I have not been clicking, have I? Respect the king. So in verses 1 through 5, in obedience to God, keep the king's commandment. Stay close to the king and don't question his ways, so that you will have his protection. I think we ought to be obedient to God, right? And we'll have his what? His protection. Verses 6 through 8. Everyone will face their final day. When that day will come is unknown. No amount of wickedness or rebellion will stop death. In fact, If you drive on the freeways and the highways around here, it looks like some fools are trying to hasten it. In fact, my dad would say when someone comes speeding past us, he says, he's in a hurry to die. Verses 9 through 13, it is not always good to rule over others. The wicked are quickly forgotten. Justice is not always executed speedily. And that goes back to what we were saying earlier, that it seems like the wicked die young because of their wickedness. But then here you have that, not a contradiction, but it's like, okay, not always. So the evil man may prolong his days, even though there is no fear of God. In spite of this, their end is not good who do not fear God. And then verses 14 through 17, good and bad happen to all. Life is not fair. Make the best of life while you can, for what tomorrow brings, no one knows. I really encourage you to read Ecclesiastes and read it over and over. It's a wonderful book, and of course packed full of wisdom. It's going to be important as far as the class. If you only get my summary of verses 14 through 17, you got the gist of it, but it's not the word, right? And I know that, and I'd rather read the word. We just don't have the time to kind of get through the subject matters at hand. In fact, I think it was last Wednesday, we were headed home, and I told Dolly, I don't think we read one verse. I alluded to all of them, but, so I don't want to be guilty of that. Of course, we have read, a few verses, but it's incumbent of on your own to put your nose in the book and pull from it the wisdom that is there for us to grasp. Any other comments?
I was gonna say that whenever we think too much in the past, we start convicting ourselves of the sins we've been forgiven if we have repented of them. So if you've repented of them, you shouldn't be looking back and romancing them, so to speak, even though it is hard not to sometimes. Put those rose-colored glasses on and start thinking about how things made you feel, and it always ends in disaster, so that much I get going for me, I always end up realizing, well, that was a disaster, so it's just not worth it.
Right. Okay, we beat the bell. Thanks.